The first time I smoked DMT, and it was over 20 years ago, not terribly far from here. My guide left the room, and I sat back with maybe the second full breath, don't quite remember. And as I started to come on, before all the high weirdness began, I was struck with an overwhelming truth, one of those overwhelming truths that come upon us at times. And it was not so much a truth as a recognition, which was, now I understand, now I know why people spend their entire lives preparing for the moment of death. And then all the weirdness started. And this has really stayed with me. In fact, it stayed with me more than almost any kind of content or visionary encounter or alternate dimension or weird alien or bug or goddess or whatever that happens in those psychoactive realms. A strange sense that the moment of death is a kind of hovers over us and is something that calls us to transform, calls us to consider, to work with it, to process it, to practice in light of this moment. And I want to emphasize that I say this not because I have any conviction, or certainly any lasting conviction, that there's something beyond the moment of death. I have no such conviction, nor do I think that this experience provided that. What it did provide was the sense that there's something in the actual process itself, whether or not my whole life flashes before me, or I suddenly grok the totality of the cosmos, or whatever it is, even if it's just the last 10 or 12 seconds as my brain shuts down. It's of such extraordinary import that it kind of reflects back through the entirety of one's life, and is sort of a call to treat what the Zen guys call the great matter of life and death. And it's that great matter that motivates my research here, which is sort of on a somewhat more scholarly, historical, cultural dimension, but it's really animated in some sense by this conviction that this is a important thing to work with. So, I think it's like the sort of 1980s Webster dictionary I was looking through, and one of the weirdest sort of loan words that they have in this dictionary is bardo, which they define as the intermediate or astral state of the soul after death and before rebirth. Which is a decent enough definition, although it's very interesting to note the occult overtones of the definition. The word astral comes really from theosophy, from this idea that we have an astral body, or there's an astral plane, a plane of kind of spiritual material above our physical plane. So it's already kind of an interesting indication of the way that this idea of the bardo, drawn from Tibetan Buddhism, plays a role in Western esoteric imagination. The source of this popularity is this very, very popular, successful book, translated first by Evans Wentz in 1927, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it's drawn, the materials that he translated and kind of redacted are drawn from a whole cycle of texts, of tantric texts that are used most essentially, although not entirely, and we'll get to that, to ritually guide the dying and the dead through these bardos, or intermediate states, after the loss of the body. The cycle was traditionally considered a terma text, or a discovered text, meaning that the fellow who compiled them or discovered them, I think around the 12th century, Karma Lingpa, discovered an earlier text that was written by the great wizard sage Padmasambhava, who's the most important figure in the Nyingma lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. And there's this sort of way that, kind of mode that Tibetan religion has, which, from a historical point of view, you would say, allows them to make changes and add new things under the authority of the greats who have come before, by discovering a magical text written by these figures from centuries earlier, which is what happened in this case. And then Evans Wentz sort of translated and repackaged this material. He didn't actually translate, he worked with a Tibetan translator. But he himself was kind of an interesting figure. He was a scholar of sorts. He went to Stanford. He did his dissertation on fairy lore in Celtic countries, a big fatty with a lot of very good information in it, but he was also a theosophist. So he kind of he's one of these 1 foot in scholarship, 1 foot in sort of seeking and weirdness, and you should never trust people like this, let me tell you. And you can kind of tell even from this picture he's got a little bit of tude, and so even here, though he's kind of sort of adopting the guise of an Asian person, in many ways, he actually kind of transformed the cycle of texts, which I'll go into more detail on. He sort of transformed them in some ways into a more Western, esoteric kind of operation. At once an art of dying and a science of death. And I should mention also that the texts that were originally called, the traditional name for this collection of texts is Great Liberation Upon Hearing in the Intermediate State, or in the Bardo. And he translated it, he changed the name to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, basically because Wallace Budge's 1895 book, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, was such a hit. So he was like, yeah, this will be a great name. And it worked. It's an incredibly successful book. Went through many printings, and one of the things that Evans Wentz emphasized in this kind of theosophical frame that he put around these Tibetan materials is this idea that the death state that's described isn't just the actual physical death, but sort of represents or suggests another kind of death experience that we might have in life. And he compares it explicitly to the kinds of initiation ceremonies that were, say, characteristic of the Greek mysteries in the age of antiquity, when people would go through some kind of harrowing, cosmic, transformative performance, and they would come out the other end having felt like they had gone to the world of the dead and returned. And this model, which, as you will see, plays an important role in understanding the psychedelic dimension of this text, was supported by some of the other materials that Evans Wentz's introduction came along with, notably texts by Lama Govinda, who was another character like him, one of these sort of scholar Westerners who was pretty smart, and they got totally into it and kind of faked their way through mysticism and sort of wrote these books that are at once scholarly and a little goofy, and an important text by Carl Jung. And Carl Jung made the same kind of argument about the value of this material, not for understanding what actually happens after physical death, but as some kind of model of an archetypal psychological process. So the book has been translated many times. We already see the way that it's moved and shifted as these Tibetan materials went through the hands of Evans Wentz. But unquestionably, the most bizarre and peculiar transformation of these texts was the psychedelic experience. A manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was published in 1964 on University Books, which was responsible for putting a lot of occultism and esotericism into the hands of ordinary folk outside of the university. Of course, we have the authors here, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert. At the time they were putting this book out, they were all still at Harvard. Leary and Alpert were both teaching there. Metzner was a grad student who was getting his PhD. By the time the book, I think, actually came out, they had all been booted out. I think Metzner left on his own, for his own reasons, but they had been kicked out. And basically what the book does is it goes through the description of the after life process laid out in these traditional materials, where you go through these various stages, which I'll get to later in the talk. And they sort of just took that as a map for the sort of typical psychedelic experience, and they actively used the text. They used Evans Wentz's text. They remixed it, added their own stuff, and created a kind of manual that would help guide people through psychedelic experience, mostly at this point LSD. Now, the first and kind of most obvious thing to say about this process that they did, particularly in our current moment with so much more concern about how Western scholars interact with non-Western sources, peoples, and cultures, is that this is an enormously brazen, crass, act of appropriation, of just ripping something out of some other context, which in some sense it was had already been done by Evans Wentz to a certain degree, but the actual text is in there with Evans Wentz. And so this is kind of the first and most easy way to talk about this text. And indeed, the few academics who write about it, most academics don't really pay much attention to psychedelic history, but the few ones who have looked at this in the context of understanding Buddhism in the West just say, this is just appropriation, it's just silly, it's ridiculous, it's worthy to be ignored. And basically what my talk and paper and research is about is suggesting that despite the goofiness of the appropriation and the problematic quality of it, is that Leary, and I'm just going to say Leary because it's easier than saying Leary et al. Or Leary, Metzner, and Alpert, and it is mostly Leary's book, that he was actually incredibly insightful and that he was productively engaging psychoactive potentials that already exist within the Tibetan concept of the Bardo. So what we're going to do is sort of look at the concept of the Bardo, how it grows within Tibetan materials, and the way in which he redeployed this for a different context in a way that I think is a lot more interesting than you might get if you just look at it from the outside. Because, and part of the reason to do this is just the fact that this is now part of our culture. The connection, Tibetan, death, Bardo, psychedelic is sort of, while somewhat esoteric, woven into our kind of popular cultural memory around psychedelics, around LSD, around Leary, around Buddhism. All those fearsome monsters in the Tibetan tankas remind us of psychedelics. We don't really know what to do with that. What is that? Why does that work? So it's really part of our understanding and experience of Tibetan religion is this weird psychedelic underpinning. And it's one of the things that's very interesting to do, and one of the things that I've done in my research is to look at, I'm no Tibetan scholar, but I've been drawing from other people who actually know how to do this stuff, is to see where these ideas come from. Where does this model of the Bardo actually come from? And it does not all originate in Tibet, but we'll see that a lot of it does. There's an example of this kind of Bardo state in earlier Indian texts, and I'll read just a little quote of it, give a flavor of what it's like. When the time of his death is approaching, he sees these signs. He sees a great rocky mountain lowering upon him like a shadow. He thinks to himself, the mountain might fall on top of me, and he makes a gesture with his hands as though to ward off the mountain. Presently, the mountain seems to be made of white cloth, and he clambers up the cloth. Then it seems to be made of red cloth. Finally, at the time of his death, as it approaches, he sees a bright light, and being unaccustomed to it at the time of his death, he is perplexed and confused. He sees all sorts of things such are seen in dreams because his mind is confused. And so this is already an Indian model of what happens in this intermediate state that gets translated and elaborated when it goes into Tibet. This bright light becomes the clear light that in the kind of classic Nyingma account that goes into the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you encounter twice upon first dying, and then it's usually just too much to handle, and so you go into the next Bardo, the Bardo of encountering reality, where you encounter these procession of cosmic gods and terrifying monsters, and you sort of go through this cycle for a bit, and then you get into a more kind of a Bardo called the Bardo of Becoming, in which you have a kind of virtual body equipped with senses, and you sort of deal with this bizarre world you're encountering, kind of dreamlike space, and then you're torn apart by the god Yama, a kind of judge who tears you apart in an act that very much resembles, if you're familiar with classic Siberian shamanism, very much resembles the way that the shaman is sort of ritually destroyed and put back together by beings of the other world, and then in this bizarrely Freudian, the language is straight Freudian. You see a couple making love, and it's written from a male perspective, of course. You see a couple making love, you want to have sex with the woman, and you're pissed off at the guy. And there, zip, you go for another round. Now, what I want to do is to talk about this concept of the Bardo and talk about how elastic it is in the Tibetan context. that it doesn't just refer to this period between the death of the physical body and then the rebirth in a new body, that it actually is a kind of plastic idea that can be applied to different things. So initially, the idea of the Bardo just refers to this after-death period, but then people begin to elaborate it. So Naropa, some of you have probably heard of Naropa, an 11th century saint. He says it applies not just to this period between birth and death, but also to dream. So, which is already a very interesting thing because we're starting to see the way that different parts of the life can be seen as a Bardo. The Karma Lingpa tradition that gives us the Tibetan Book of the Dead further expands this concept to take in meditation and the dying process itself. So one scholar writes, by the first half of the 12th century, there had already been such a remarkable proliferation of ideas inspired by the generic notion of a period of transition between two states of consciousness that seemingly every significant experience or phase of existence could be divided into a series of bardos. And this is part of the idea we're talking about, that there's something very productive about the notion of the bardo, of an in-between, of shifting between consciousness. So the importance with dreams, for example, is not that dreams take you to another world and you encounter spirits and you fly or whatever you do in the dream. Really, the important part of the dream is the fact that you wake up from it. And in that waking up from the dream, there is this split, this kind of montage, a cut between different states of consciousness. And that cut can be elaborated and applied to all sorts of different things in life. In later accounts, in different Buddhist accounts of it, the orgasm is a bardo. Even sneezing is a bardo. Because it's all about these sort of intense shifts of consciousness. And part of the kind of model, kind of the mind frame, the world view of this tantric approach is to see the way that these little bardos resonate with or replicate the bardo. And there's a great Robert Thurman quote where he says, he describes this kind of tantric worldview as a method of compressing eons of lives into one life, eons of deaths into one death, and eons of betweens, of bardos, into one between. So this is, I think one of the ways to look at it, and where you really find this, what's really interesting, is that if you look at the texts themselves that are already gathered together in these Tibetan materials, initially it looks like they're all just about things that are read to people on their deathbed or who are already dead, as if the dead person can still hear the reader and be guided, be reminded by the voice of the guide why all these terrifying, completely unexpected things are happening to try to keep them from losing their shit. So maybe they can get out on the clear light, and if not, then maybe they can recognize the inherent emptiness of everything and transcend that way. So that's the sort of main model. But there's already a very interesting ambiguity in the texts themselves. If you look at them closely, you discover that some of them actually aren't designed to be read to the dead. Some of them are actually protocols for meditation. Some of them are actually recipes for tantric visionary meditation for people who are alive. And the basic idea here is that as a living practitioner, I would imagine going through these stages, and I would recapitulate or simulate this process on my own as a living person so to better prepare myself for when it actually happens. So there's this very interesting tension in the texts themselves, and that I'm going to suggest has a lot to say to the psychedelic appropriation of the Bardo concept, that there's a kind of tension in the texts themselves between the thing itself and the simulacra of the thing itself, or the run-through, the simulation, an airplane simulation or something, a rehearsal, a tantric rehearsal. And so you find this kind of running throughout the things, which kind of already makes you, the question of appropriation then changes kind of slightly. And it changes a lot when you start thinking about psychedelic experience. Here's an image of the Bardo of Reality. So you miss the clear light, and then you get to see all of these marvelous gods and terrifying monsters. This is a very interesting element of the Tibetan model that does not have anything to do with Indian Buddhism as far as we can tell. So, and I'll get into a little bit more, well, if it's not from Indian Buddhism, where does it come from? We'll talk about that in a little bit more. But let's talk a little bit about psychedelics as death simulation. So if you go into the lore and you look at, let's say, the first LSD trip that we have on record, presumably this person did not really know what LSD was like. Presumably they didn't have some idea in their head that LSD could produce a death trip, but they had one nonetheless. This is Albert Hofmann describing one aspect of his trip after he got home from his bicycle ride and made his way into his living room. This is what he experiences. Dizziness, visual distortions. The faces of those present appeared like grotesque colored masks, strong agitation alternating with paresis, with frozenness. The head, body, and extremities sometimes cold and numb, throat dry and shriveled, a feeling of suffocation. A bummer. Occasionally, I felt as being outside my body. I thought I had died. My ego was suspended somewhere in space, and I saw my body lying dead on the sofa. So here we have in the sort of, foundation stone of the LSD trip, we have this death rehearsal. In Huxley's Doors of Perception, though it's not the main part of it, it's not the part that most people talk about or remember, he also goes through a kind of dress rehearsal rag, one that significantly, specifically mentions the Tibetan Book of the Dead. At one point, he's confronted by a chair, and this terrifying chair looks like the Last Judgment, quote, or to be more accurate, by a Last Judgment which, after a long time and with considerable difficulty, I recognized as a chair. Then he remembers the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he remembers the idea that the soul shrinks away from the clear light to shelter in the comforting darkness of selfhood as a reborn human being. And this is what he feels like he's doing. He's pulling away. He can't handle it. And later on, his wife asked him if there was some way that he might have been able to resist his own resistance. And he says, only if there was somebody there to tell me about the clear light. I couldn't do it myself. One couldn't do it by oneself. To Tim Leary, who by the early 60s, before he gets kicked out of Harvard, is a successful professor of psychology. Interesting work focusing on personality typologies and social agency. So he took mushrooms in Mexico, but what's important here is his first LSD trip through the medium of Michael Hollingshead's mayonnaise jar of LSD. He described it as the most shattering experience of my life. So he's at home in Cambridge by himself. His family's there. I mean, he's the only one on acid. He idiotically, later trippers would, no, don't do it, Tim. He turns on the TV. And the TV tells him directly that he's dead. You're dead. You're dead. And he gets away from the TV and he starts going through books, because he's a nerd. He's an intellectual. So he starts going through books and he sees the way that every word kind of devolves into the origins, its sort of primordial origins of language. And every time it's the same morpheme. Death, death, death. Everything was illusion, he said later of the experience, even love. Not long afterwards, he delivered a talk at the International Congress of Applied Psychology. And I don't remember the name of this talk, but it's really, really interesting and important to read. I mean, Leary had an enormous influence on the way people thought about psychedelics then, and to some degree the way we think about them today. And he did a very interesting kind of tango dance of like spiritual and not spiritual, naturalism and more than just psychology. And this talk really shows him at the point when he's still a professional psychologist, but he's starting to dissolve. He can't really hold on to it anymore. But the way he thinks about it, I think, is really key to understanding not just the subject, but psychedelics in the 60s in general. So at that point, like a lot of people in that time, Leary thought about psychology or social situations in terms of the metaphor of the game. We what we do is we play games. I'm the game of the guy who knows something, and so I'm standing up here and I'm playing this game, and that structures you as like an audience. So you're playing the audience game where you kind of listen, and you get a little bored, and you get a little sleepy, and then you listen again, you think about what you're going to do tomorrow, and then you listen again, and so we have these games that structure our personality. So we think we're doing something when it's actually the game that's working. So Leary starts to take this model, which is obvious in sort of typical human interaction, and he starts to expand it into larger and larger, more kind of metaphysical principles. So he talks about how ordinary perception and even science are structured by the subject-object game, this game of dualism. While the most treacherous game of all is the ego game, that there is an I, that there's some kind of agency, some kind of decider. So defining the mystic or visionary as the one who, quote, sees clearly the game structure of behavior, he outlines this pragmatic program of what he calls applied mysticism. And this program includes the idea that great trauma can shatter the gamesmanship out of you and free you up to play better games. In a way, in a nutshell, this is the whole 60s, 70s approach to psychology. You see it in encounter groups, you see it in drug use, you see it in changing ideas of madness. This is the idea that you can intensify things so much that you break down. You have a traumatic experience, you have a death experience, and out of this you not only see more clearly the games you normally play, but you free yourself up for better games. Another quote, the mystic experience is the non-game, the meta-game experience. So here he's sort of mashing up social psychology and comparative mysticism. And this is part of the other thing that's happening to Leary. So as he starts to have these experiences and think about these things, he wasn't traditionally interested in religion or mysticism at all. But as he's doing this, he's kind of going, oh, what's going on? In some ways, this religious language is appropriate for these experiences. And he goes on and he meets people. He meets Houston Smith. Anybody knows who Houston Smith is? Right, just a couple of folks. But he was a very important mid-century guy who talked about the secret connection between all religions, a point of view that's known as perennialism. This is the idea, and Aldous Huxley very much shared this idea, and it really structures his thought. It's the idea that behind all the different mystical paths, all the different religions of the world, there really is one shared experience. And so it doesn't really matter in some sense, and in some sense all of them are talking about the same thing. And if you have this point of view, you're sort of encouraged to make connections. You say, well, the Zen Satori really isn't that different than Meister Eckhart, even though from a more traditional or critical historical point of view, they're totally different. They don't have anything to do with each other. But no. Behind the surface of the cultural differences, there's some core experience, and that's the idea of perennialism. It's an idea that was very important to Houston Smith, who was a professor in Cambridge, and was friends with Leary, and also was one of the participants in the Good Friday experiment, which some of you know about, which had to do precisely with how psychedelics seem to be able to produce something like religious experience, at the very least a simulation of religious experience. So Leary's already getting kind of excited about this, and he runs into Huxley not that long before Huxley dies, and Huxley says, hey man, we need a guide. Of course, Aldous Huxley didn't say, hey man, that's me. But Huxley's like, we need a guidebook for the psychedelic experience. We need a way for you to put this in a kind of language that can be helpful for people who are going through this. Why don't we do it with the Tibetan Book of the Dead? So that actually comes from Huxley. So then Larry's like, great, let's do it. And so after this experience, when this is Alpert and future Ram Dass, his glasses are back. The thick black glasses, they're back. So he's on it there. So what Leary said is, hey, okay, let's take the book. And there's a quote from Metzner where he says, Metzner goes, Leary said, let's take the text of the Tibetans and strip the particular cultural and religious language and rewrite it as a manual. I mean, the more clear example of straight-up appropriation you couldn't get, as well as a perennialist idea, that it's the local and specific religious and cultural language that you can get out of the way in order to get to this meaty core experience, this experience that he believed was replicated in the psychedelic experience. So in a way, Leary was lining up with Evans Wentz, with Carl Jung, and saying, this thing about the dead body and saying it to the dead body and that the spirit is actually in these other realms, that's just a facade for an experience that happens in life, that we can experience as living people going through a simulated death and rebirth process, just like they did in the mystery religions, just like they do in Tantra, and just like we do now with our new thanatological chemicals. So, what's really interesting about this, thinking about it, is that in some ways we can say, okay, this is totally typical Western colonialist appropriation of the mysteries of the other people, and where you change it and use it for your own purposes. Totally clear that that's what's going on. But if you're interested, as I am, in the history of religions and how religions change, and particularly how they change when they encounter one another, harder to simply discount it for that reason. And one of the great examples of this is the way in which the Tibetans appropriated Buddhism. So Buddhism grows up in India and northern India. It flourishes for a couple of centuries. By this point, it's been going on for about 800, 900 years when it makes its way into Tibet. And it's sort of a complicated story, but it shows up and then it kind of goes away and then it comes back with a vengeance. And so we can look at this process of what actually happened there. What was transformed? How did the Tibetans appropriate? And there are other scholars who look at this and go, look, we might think that Leary's kind of ridiculous, but if you go back to Tibet at the same time, you find the same kind of thing. You have a bunch of crazies with their visions and scholastics who are trying to hold on to the old texts and keep them faithful, and all sorts of strange politics of different ways of interpreting these things. And so what we find is that the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or really the texts that are represented by the Tibetan Book of the Dead, are themselves a perfect example of how this transformation happens as one cultural group's religion gets appropriated and transformed by another group. In this case, how Indian Buddhism gets transformed into Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly how a new indigenous and arguably shamanic dimension enters into Buddhist Tantra through the mediation of this transformation that the Tibetans are doing, represented again in no better place than the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So there's two ways to, I'll go back to this one. There's two ways that the Tibetan Book of the Dead introduces something that we don't find in the Indian Tantric or Indian Buddhist texts. One of them is the Bardo of Reality. One of them is the idea that after death, whether you like it or not, you get to confront the whole panoply of gods and monsters. You're going to get it one way or the other. Hope you can hold on. Hope you can keep your shit together. And this kind of model is much more similar. And again, we're in this speculative realm where you can't really prove it because there's not text, and we're talking about things 1,000 years ago, and scholars are very cautious about it. But the only place you really see this kind of model is if you look at anthropological records of Siberian shamanism. If you're familiar with Mircea Eliade's book Shamanism, which was itself a kind of perennialist book about how this one idea of shamanism coming out of Siberia can apply to lots of different groups, and he was finding these regular patterns. And one of the patterns is precisely this kind of after-death experience where you're guided by the shaman through these different domains of gods and monsters. So that's one of the ways that the Tibetan indigenous shamanic culture changed these materials as it went into Tibet. The other way is the role of the guide itself. The idea that there is a guide, someone who's speaking, someone who's directly addressing the dead person. Again, we don't find this in the Indian texts, and there's some evidence that if you go back to some of the earliest written materials we have from Tibet, that there's something indigenous going on with this notion of a guide. Here's a quote from a text that is like 400 years earlier than the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Again, now listen, you who are deceased, fickle impermanence, the real nature of the whole world has at this time befallen you. So there's this idea of a guide, of a kind of shamanic guide. And what Leary et al. Do in some ways is to transform this figure into the idea of a psychedelic guide. The idea that to maximize your psychedelic experience, you need a guide. You need someone there. You need someone who can shape it for you or who can create what we would call now a sort of safe container. Now, at this point, the Leary folks are pretty big on, they have a pretty big interpretation of their role as guides. And reading the manual is kind of funny because they're really kind of, in a way, amping their own sort of ability to see what's going on, because the guide isn't just the man Leary or the man Metzner. And the way they did their groups, they did their things collectively, where different people would take on the role of the person who was recording what was going on, where everybody else tripped their balls off. And everyone, they were mostly balls, I'm afraid. It was not mostly guys doing this kind of thing at the time. And but it's not just the people who are guides. The manual itself, the book, the psychedelic experience, the book, was also a guide, just the same way as the Tibetan Book of the Dead is in some sense a script for a human person to read to the dead, but it's also itself a guide. The text itself is also a guide. And the Leary folks took this to the nines, not only by saying, hey, you can use this book to help shape your LSD trip, but by saying, if you want to, you can actually record the prayers on magnetic tape and play it back for yourself when you're in your experience. So there's this weird kind of almost cybernetic idea about the guide and about using it in order to wake up. So I want to talk a little bit now about how Leary rewrites these phases. How do these traditional basic stages of the Bardo get rewritten in the book, The Psychedelic Experience? The kinds of initial physical symptoms, the ones that Hoffman described, that discomfort, the sense of shaking, that sort of physical challenge, for Leary, these become signs heralding transcendence. And if fears and attachments are released, what he calls the period of ego loss or non-game ecstasy dawns. This is the clear light, according to Leary, who defines liberation as the nervous system devoid of mental conceptual activity. So again, we can see the way that Leary is like playing both ends against the middle in terms of like appropriating not just Tibetan materials, but spiritual, supernatural, transcendental ideas, and then naturalizing them, bringing them into psychology, bringing them into an idea of the nervous system running various psychological programs. But this idea of true ego loss or non-game ecstasy, according to him, is very difficult to maintain. And the personal and genetically inherited dispositions of most people drive them into the second and third bardos, which he calls periods. During the period of hallucinations, this mandala or group of peaceful and wrathful deities, the gods and monsters I talked about, is recast as a hallucinatory parade of complexes like, quote, the retinal circus or the vibratory waves of external unity. Here the Leary text, which both samples and remixes the actual language of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, simply repeats the traditional Tibetan exhortation to remember the inherent lack of substance in the images and experiences. This is an amazing point, because as I'm saying, he takes this material that is profoundly embedded in a supernatural, transcendental, mystical model, if you want to call it mystical, of other levels of reality where there actually is an afterlife, and he's naturalizing it. He's bringing it into a more psychological language. But in this sense, he's saying almost exactly the same thing, because in the traditional Tibetan context, what they're saying is, just remember, your mind is making this. Your mind is making the gods. Your mind is making the monsters. And if you can really see that these things don't have any inherent existence, you really see that your mind is making, not even your mind, the mind is making it, then you have a chance at liberation. And here's how Leary plays with that idea. In one of the redacted Tibetan prayers, that means it's a Tibetan prayer that he transformed, that they give at the end of the text. Here's some prayers that you can use during your trip. It goes like this. Voidness cannot injure voidness. None of the peaceful or wrathful visions, blood-drinking demons, machines, monsters, or devils exist in reality, only within your skull. And most of that is from the Tibetan language, not the machines and not the skull. But in some sense, he's saying the same thing. And there's an important point, which may sound a little bit academic, but I think is more important to this. One of the big criticisms that someone might make of this Leary work is to say, look, not only are you appropriating, but you're appropriating with this perennialist idea that beneath all the different cultural formations, there is just this one sort of experience that we all have access to. There's an essential human mind, and this perennialist idea is clearly false. It's clearly a superimposition, a kind of colonialist construct where we say, oh, everyone's really talking about the same thing, and by the way, I know what that same thing is. So it's a very kind of problematic approach. But Leary's actually doing something a little bit more complicated than that, which is not saying that there is this fundamental reality behind all of these differences. He's saying that the fundamental reality that's behind all these differences is the deconstruction of reality, is the inability to see the game as a game or as reality anymore, to see through it, to deconstruct the self, to deconstruct our ideas about who we are, about what world we in are, or what demons are, what machines are. It's all in your skull. So it's a little bit more interesting and a little bit more complicated and potentially a little bit more what was actually going on in the first place. Tibetan scholars argue about the usefulness of the term shamanism to describe what's going on in indigenous Tibetan religion. It's a tough word. It clearly says something. It clearly helps us understand what's similar about very, very different phenomena from Siberia to South America to North America to Africa. People talk about shamans. Are they really the same? Are they really different? How can we really talk about it? So people are very wary about using the term. Some people are okay with it. One of these guys, Gregory Samuel, points out that the shamanism, that the indigenous elements of Tibetan culture that last within Tibetan Buddhism aren't just the kind of low stuff like village necromancers and astrology and possession rituals and the sort of like, village fringe stuff outside of the monasteries. What he says is that some of the most highest teachings, particularly the high tantra teachings, are themselves really transformation of these shamanic currents rather than specifically Buddhist currents. And he has a wonderful description of the shaman that is so Leary-like. I just got to read it. So much coming from the same place that Leary's coming from when he talks about non-game ecstasy. So this is Samuel's talking about the shaman's death and resurrection show. The training of the shaman involves the acquisition of control over a series of different potentialities or modes of operation within human experience. If shamans are to operate with these modes or deal with the spirits, in other words, they have to acquire some kind of further mode or state from which they can view them and balance them within themselves and in their social context. In the process, they have to transcend or go beyond the normal experience of the world taken for granted within their social and cultural context. This is the meaning of the symbolic death that forms a common part of shamanic training and initiation. So in a way, he's saying the same thing. He's saying in order for the shaman to function as a healer, as someone who can balance the energies both within a social community and between that community and its external environment, whether it's what we call nature, or whether it's animals, or whether it's other people, that in order to really do that, the shaman has to be able to step outside of that local reality, to find some way of breaking down the self, of breaking down normal identifications in order to gain a kind of meta perspective, or a meta game in Leary's language, a meta game perspective. So in this sense, Leary, and possibly even what was going on with some of these characters, isn't really captured by this idea that there's some essential nature to human beings, and that's why all these things, when you boil them down, Zen is like Eckhart, and we're all kind of doing the same thing. What they're really saying is that we all have the same possibility of deconstructing our local realities. And I want to end with just talking a little bit about how the influence of this book was marked on psychedelic history and up to today. Because the psychedelic experience doesn't hold up well. If you read it, it's very dated, it's very ponderous, it's kind of arrogant, it's kind of sort of Germanic in this weird way. And the way that we remember Huxley's Doors of Perception or Alan Watts's Joyous Cosmology, these are classics. They're very beautiful. They still speak to us in a way. The psychedelic experience, it's a little bit harder to track. And in fact, all of its authors at various points kind of distance themselves from what they had done, partly because the appropriation is so obvious, partly because they get so much wrong about Tibetan Buddhism, partly because it's so clearly kind of crazy in some sort of way. But I think we sort of do ourselves a disservice by forgetting it, because it really is quite significant, not only in terms of an interesting example or a very significant example of how Tantric and Buddhist ideas came into the West, and indeed reminds us that the whole history of Buddhism in the West, the whole thing in the post-war period, as Buddhism really starts to become popular, is inextricable from psychedelics. Most Buddhist teachers don't want you to know that. They don't want to talk about that. Most Buddhist historians of Buddhism in America, increasingly they do acknowledge this because they have to, because it's true, but it's another one of those, sweep the drugs under the carpet kind of moves. And so that's part of the forgetting of this book, is forgetting of this kind of dimension of it. But even more specifically is that people in that period of time, so the book comes out in 1964, the 63 and 64 are just the years when LSD is leaking out of the lab. This means out of the research centers and out of the kind of elite Hollywood psychotherapeutic circles where it was circulating among, stars and sort of more hoity-toity folk, and becoming available to the masses, becoming available to crews like Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. But it's also before it becomes scheduled and kind of goes underground and really begins to massify. So it's a very sweet spot, 64 to 66, 67 in psychedelic history in the United States anyway. And this book was fundamental. Fundamental. You talk to people from that era, almost everyone was like, oh yeah, we took that book really seriously. So there was this period where this book helped shape what it meant to do psychedelics. Maybe psychedelics maybe it doesn't help. But it was the case that particularly the idea of ego death, that the point of psychedelics was to have a traumatic ego death, and that this was going to give you what you wanted, was really kind of part of the lore. That's what you were doing. That's what you expected to have happen or hoped to have happen. Later on, people were like, maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe this heavy-handed guide stuff really isn't so helpful. And by the 70s, psychedelic guides and therapists and people working with people as guides, developed much more minimal methods, although some of them still emphasize this kind of traumatic sort of rupture. But at that point, it was really very significant. Here, this is just one example of this guy, just as kind of evidence for this, John Griggs. And John Griggs in the early 60s was one of these, he was like basically a thug, a San Jose grifter, greaser, thief. Who, was partying and taking a lot of speed and riding motorcycles, and he had his whole crew. And then he heard that there was I think then he moved, I can't remember when he went to the South End, but at some point he moved south. But he heard about this psychiatrist that's right, he was from Orange County. Excuse me, I'm mixing up with two stories, but the characteristic is the same. He heard about this shrink who's got a store of acid. So he went up and he stole his LSD, brought it back down, took it, and had a complete life-changing religious experience. So much so that he took the rest of the acid back. He gave it back to the guys. I'm sorry. And then started wearing flowers and, became this guy. And when they would do acid, and he turned on everybody, and he ended up being the head honcho behind the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was extremely important in terms of the distribution of LSD in California and actually throughout the United States. Orange Sunshine came through the Brotherhood. They brought in a lot of the Afghani hash, and so they were a very important drug distributor, but really took it seriously. They meant it, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. It wasn't just the name of a drug gang. And when he did drugs or he wanted people to do it, it was all about the Leary experience and this sort of psychedelic experience. So it's important to see it historically, this book, and the connections that it makes, and again, the way in which it's not just some facile appropriation or simple exoticism, the way we see exoticism now, vis-a-vis shamans in South America. Oh, they know everything or whatever. Oh, let's just take their culture and try to run with it. It wasn't just that. And it was also recognizing something inherent in the Bardo concept, that this idea of of moving between states, and more so, that these betweens resonated, so that my orgasm or even my sneeze could resonate with my death, and therefore be used as preparation or as confrontation or experiencing that death, at least in a simulated sense, was just ideal for psychedelics. Because that's what it, in a way, that's what it's doing. That's part of its potential, of its inherent potential, not just because we have expectations. It's part of the process, I believe, itself. And then the other way that that's manifesting now, I had an image, but it didn't show up. It was a picture of the sort of therapy room at Johns Hopkins when they were doing this psilocybin studies about 10 years ago that led to the 2006 study that came out that basically proved what we already knew from the 60s, which is that under certain circumstances, psychedelics can produce profound religious experiences. But more importantly than that study are a number of studies that are happening now that have to do with using psychedelics for people facing the end of life. So people who are cancer patients, people who have tremendous anxiety and fear, and using psychedelics as a way to ameliorate that, to get them prepared, to get us all prepared for what's going to happen, whether we want it to or not. And I think these studies are incredibly profound. Not only because they seem to show that this can really work. You can take people who are naive about drugs and don't have drug experience, and it's not even really a drug anymore. It's a medicine, it's a healing agent, it's a pathogen, whatever you want to call it, can take psychedelics, and in the proper structure, the proper setting, and set and setting are part of the story, and I'll wind up with that in just a second. In the right situation, they can really change. They can really grapple with these fears and move forward. But what I really like about the mortality psychedelic studies is because it's a wonderful wedge. It's a wonderful foot in the door. Why? Because we're all in that position. We're all terrified before death. I'm terrified. You're probably terrified. You probably spent a lot of your time avoiding it. Oh, distract. Oh, no, nope, not going to happen today. Not happening today. Nope. And so in some sense, we're all there with the cancer patient who gets the news or the person who's experiencing extreme anxiety. And once we kind of recognize that, I would like to think, in a sane future, that this will enable all of us to be able to access these things in more open context because we're all in the same plight. On the note on set and setting, that was just one little bit I wanted to throw in there, is that in talking about the importance of the psychedelic experience within psychedelic culture, and indeed culture in general, is that the psychedelic experience was also the vehicle for the very idea of set and setting, which is the most consistent, necessary, profound, and in some ways under-theorized, meaning people don't quite recognize the full consequences of the concept within and without psychedelic culture, within the whole history of talking about these things in the West. Set and setting is set front and center. And the psychedelic experience, the book about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is the place where the idea of set and setting is sort of released and introduced into the world. So with that, I think I will close.